let's talk about functions. This is just meant to be an introduction, not a full-blown explanation. There are obviously plenty of textbooks out there that I expect most students would be using already. This is just meant to sort of help maybe kickstart someone who's not familiar at all. So that's the goal here, is just to sort of get over the initial challenges of what it is. So without further ado, so a function, so a mathematical function. I like to think of it as a box or a machine, and you drop something in it, and you turn a crank, and it does whatever the rules say, which we'll talk about more, of course. And when you get done, you get an output. And I think the most important thing to remember with a mathematical function is the way we normally define them is you get one thing in, and when you get done, you get one thing out. So we have one input with one arrow and one arrow coming out. Throughout this discussion, I have colors here to sort of remind us of the fact that these are really the three pieces that we're going to talk about. So if I put something in and I turn the crank, the input comes in, you do the math, and eventually you get your output. And that's kind of the idea. So next, let's talk about the fact that mathematicians aren't going to want to use words in their formulas. There's not enough room. You'd wind up with paragraphs just to represent something that describes a line or something simple. So we want to use really, really short, forms to describe things. So typically, and I actually don't know why, but we actually typically use X and Y when we're first discussing functions with new students. X we'll usually use as the input, so that's why I'm showing this here. F, at least, is pretty obvious why we use F for the word function. And that will describe the rules that are used to work on the input. And then the output is very often referred to as Y. Again, I don't actually know why. So the next interesting thing to really understand here is, and not get confused by, is when you see this F with X in parentheses. It does not mean to multiply F times X. That's probably one of those things that when you're brand new, you might wonder what this means or what do I do with it. It is strictly a reminder that we're using a function called F and that X is coming into it. So this F with the X in parentheses is really just a reflection of what's happening up here. You notice I got the three lines here. What I'm saying is Y is equivalent to F, and we use the phrase F of X, F being a function of X coming in. So that's the kind of the terminology that we will use for functions. That's why we have the F, and so on. So the next most obvious thing to do next would be to just try an example here. So let's go ahead and we'll stick with X, of course, as an input. And let's use X plus 3 just as an example of a function, something you might do with the input. In this case, what this is saying is, well, whatever I put into this machine, which is X, I'm then going to add 3 to that value, and then that means I'll get whatever comes out, which is Y, which in fact is then therefore equal to X plus 3 in this case. Just as another reminder, you might see this here. You might see F of X equals X plus 3. So that means the same thing, right? So Y and F of X are effectively the same. But again, we use X and Y, and it is nice for graphing. You don't have to graph functions, but it's very informative. So in the next video, I will actually be discussing graphing and also the slope. Since this is a line, it's a good. We'll use a line as the first discussion of slope. Excuse me. So the next thing to do is to take a look at. I mean, right now this is still just an expression. We haven't really done any math. We've just said, oh well, here's what one function might look like. If I were to use this one, and again, it could be something else. It could be X plus 8. It could be X squared, which would mean X times X. It could be X squared plus 3. There's a lot. Obviously, it's an infinite number of things it could be. Let's look at this one though. So if I go to this, don't let all this freak you out initially. So let's just look at the yellow line first here, and I'll explain that, and then you'll see what these others are. So the yellow one here, this is where the X is 0. If you notice, I tried to stick with the color so you can kind of see what goes with what. So this means that we're going to drop a 0 into the machine, and we're going to turn the crank, Now, turning the crank in this case means plugging in the x in here with this value of 0. So that means that f looks like this. It looks like 0 plus 3 in this case. You literally take the x out, stick the 0 in for x. And you follow that wherever the x appears in the function. Then you do the math, which is turning the crank. And in this case, you get 3. 0 plus 3 is 3. So that means the output is 3. And if you notice, if you plug in 0 and add 3, you can only get 3, which means this is a function. One thing in gives one thing out. There aren't two things you can get out. So the thing to remember next is the fact that, I chose 0 here as our first example point. And I have some other ones that I've pre-calculated here. But you can pick any number you want, and that's probably where it starts getting really kind of interesting and maybe even fascinating, because even though I've picked numbers like -5, -10, or maybe 10, there's nothing important about these particular numbers. They just happen to be easily randomly picked because they, separated by 5. You could put in any number you want, and you will then turn the crank and get something unique out. So next I'll be talking about more particulars about this particular function with lines and things. But just as an example, I thought it'd be interesting to show you that we could do something like x plus 8, and all of a sudden you now see that you get different outputs for the same inputs. And that's obviously because we changed the function. We could even make it x squared, which means x times x. Well, so what does that mean? So it means if I plug in 0, 0 squared is 0 times 0, and then plus 8 gives me 8. If I were to stick in 5, that gives me 5 times 5 is 25, plus the 8 gives me the 33. So the idea here is that it doesn't matter what you put in. You follow the rules, you get something out. So anyways, like I said, I will make the next one about lines in particular, and a little bit about graphing and the slope. And then hopefully you find it interesting and watch the other videos. Thanks. Bye.